today we're going to look at 1 Timothy chapter 6. We're going to end the book of 1 Timothy today. And in verse 1 he says, all under slavery. Now, when he says all under slavery, there was slavery in that time. And the Bible doesn't talk a lot about the morality or immorality of slavery. Although, the Bible would teach, if you look at the principles of the fact that it's immoral to put a person under that kind of a yoke, that we should be free. But the point is, God, His desire on earth for us as believers is not to be social activists. In other words, your goal is to win people to Christ, not to change society. Now, should we vote? Absolutely. No question about it. I believe in that. But there wasn't this movement to overthrow slavery. But the point of this passage is, how should you be with people who are over you? And really, I think this applies to an employer-employee relationship. You are under your master, and you're serving him. How should you be? Well, he says that you should give them full respect so that God's name isn't slandered. The way you work at your job is going to affect God's name on this earth. If you give your all, then God's name is going to be glorified and praised. People are going to say, wow, Christians do good work. If you steal from your employer, stealing time, stealing pencils, whatever it is, God's name gets slandered. He says in verse 2, if you've got a believing master, that doesn't mean you can slack off. How many times have you heard someone come to your door, hey, I want to do this job for you, and hey, I'm a Christian. And what's that make you say usually? Oh. Usually you're like, they're a Christian. I've done business with Christians before. And oftentimes we get a bad name because these people say, I'm a Christian. You should hire me. Be careful. Be careful. If you're going to go out there and tell people you're a Christian, you better do work that would really honor God. Now, you ought to do that anyway. But when you put yourself out there as a Christian, which I don't have any problem with, you need to make sure that you're doing it even better for believers, he says in verse 2. But you need to do it in a way where God is going to get the glory for the kind of work you do and how you stand behind your work. Well, in verse 3, he shifts gears and begins to talk about false teachers. And there is one characteristic that is always there with a false teacher. And that is this. They love money. Now, this passage doesn't talk about it as much as some of the other ones do. But this one talks about the doctrine that they're going to teach. And one of the main doctrines that false teachers are going to come up with is this. God wants you to be rich and healthy and fulfill all of your dreams, and nothing is going to go wrong in your life when you finally do what God, when you take Jesus and you send me your check and your prayer cloth, and everything's going to be great. That's false teaching. He says in verse 3, if anyone teaches false doctrines, and in verse 5 he says, if you think that godliness is a means to financial gain, that's a false doctrine. Thinking that godliness is going to get you financial gain, that doesn't work. Now, God has promises in the Bible for tithing, and we'll talk more about that later. And they're good promises, and God's going to bless you for that. But it's not a means of financial gain. He says in verse 6, godliness with contentment is great gain. Great gain is not having $1 million in the bank, or $10 million in the bank, or some big trust fund. Great gain is when you live for God, and you are content with the things that God gives you. That's where the joy comes from. That's where the vivaciousness of life comes from. And that's where God wants us to be. He says in verse 7, this is, I got to think about it. You brought nothing in the world, and you're going to take nothing out of it. So this world's just temporary. It's like staying in a hotel. You have 1 billion years on the other side. This is a hotel stay. When you go to a hotel, and you're going to be there for a night, do you say, I'm going to go out and I'm going to go to Serpent City and I'm going to put a flat screen on this wall. I'm going to go to Home Depot, get a new toilet, get a new sink, install this thing. I might go to Lowe's and find some new carpet because I don't really like this carpet color very well. I'm going to paint the walls. Do you do that in a hotel? No way! You say, I'm not going to get comfortable here. This isn't my home. Don't do that on the earth either. You came in with nothing. You're going to leave with nothing. Look, send it on ahead is what God says to you. You don't got to worry about this place. Well, in verse 7, he says that or verse 8, he says, we got to be content with food and clothing. Now, if you have food and you have clothing, doesn't got to be, from Saks Fifth Avenue, but you got food and clothes, we got to be content. And when we're not, you are letting the world know that you have an idol. I hate to say that because, folks with this little idol of materialism, they tell everybody about it. How do we tell everyone about it? Well, I just don't have as good a house as I should have, and it's just not done like I want it done, and my cars aren't as nice as they should be, and, I don't have enough money to go to this or that, or it's materialism. God says we have to be content with food and clothing. And these aren't my words. These are God's words. They're right there on verse 8. And if we're not, we get in trouble. Verse 9, he says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap, into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge men into ruin and perdition. If you want riches, you're going to be tempted and have foolish and harmful desires and have traps that you should never even be a part of. He said, I don't want to be rich. I just want this and this and this and this and this. You want to be rich. If it's more than food and more than clothing, he says that your desires are riches. Stop it. Stop it. Be happy with what you got. That's the point of this passage. In verse 10, he says, for the love of money. This is the problem. Not money. If you have money, great. It's the love of money that's the root of all evil. And he says, some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. He says to Timothy, flee these things and pursue, in verse 11, righteousness, godliness, faith, love, endurance, and gentleness. If you're going to run from the love of money, you got to run toward something and run toward loving God and loving righteousness. Now in verse 17, he's going to come back and say, look, if you got money, that's okay. Having money is not wrong. It's the love of money. It's the desire for money. It's wanting to get rich. If you've got it, fine. That's okay. He says in verse 17, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant. Don't be all proud of it. God gave it to you. And to put their hope in wealth. Don't put your hope in this. This isn't where you get your needs met. Don't put your hope in that, he says. But command them to do good and be rich in good deeds and generous and willing to share. Well, what a great passage when it comes to money. Everybody needs to understand what's going on in 1 Timothy chapter 6, because money is part and parcel of our lives. And the desire for money can get into our hearts, and it's tough to get it out. This is how you got to think about it. Nothing in, nothing out. If you have money, do good with it. Whatever you got, be content. Well, God bless you. Have a great day.